The resolution we're going to be debating is, Annex 1 countries of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change should provide significantly increased aid to developing countries specifically for climate change adaptation. The UN recognizes 5 countries that were devastated by climate change the most, and those countries are Ethiopia, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Maldives, and Malawi. Out of these countries, we decided to formulate an adaptation plan for Ethiopia. Some people feel that the only way to combat climate change is to reform our lifestyles to be better accustomed to the alterations of the environment. Now, others believe that mitigation is the best route to take. Mitigation is the method of attacking climate change directly.
We propose the following plan: to provide a multi-tiered climate adaptation policy to provide adequate resources and capital. In the country of Ethiopia, one of the first which will feel the effects of climate change, we believe that the U.S. should assist with adaptation by 1, providing food aid in the case of famine, 2, developing irrigation to deal with the drought, 3rd, assisting with public health in cases of the disease outbreak, and working with local efforts toward adaptation and environmental sustainability.
While the affirmative team makes excellent use of rhetoric, they fail to present a proposal that will allow for long-term solvency. Let's look at some of the key components of the affirmative strategy. Providing food aid, developing irrigation, assisting with public health assistance. While these efforts are noble and honorable, they're no different than the other billions of dollars of aid that have been poured into Africa attempts prior. If you wish to give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, he'll feed an entire village. This is the mentality that is absolutely necessary when preparing to give aid. While the approach of the affirmative is a valiant, it's an outlook that's doomed to failure. This is why we, the negative team, advocate a multilateral approach involving the full commitment of both government and non-government organizations to help both the adaptation and mitigation of climate change in Ethiopia. This includes, but is not limited to, the advancement of climate change policy, the financing of energy efficiency, promotion of renewable energy and green jobs. The internal community should also develop hydropower, solar, wind, and biomass technologies for Ethiopia. Our alternative action plan solves the problems outlined by the affirmative. Adaptation to climate change will never be enough. We must mitigate the effects of global warming and the large impacts on Ethiopia if we can wish to create change.
The negative's principal argument that they'd like to make about our climate adaptation plan is that instead of trying to adapt to the effects of global warming that we're going to see over the next decade, that we should instead try and mitigate them in the country of Ethiopia. However, there's a couple of problems with the idea of having a global initiative to reduce carbon emissions. First of all, it's been tried before. We haven't seen any real results. And the reason that we haven't seen any real results is that there is an economic incentive to keep polluting. See, this is what necessitates the idea of adaptation.
The first argument made by the affirmative in their second speech is that mitigation has been tried before, and things like the Kyoto Protocol have failed. However, Evan has not seen the effects of the Kyoto Protocol and what it's been able to do because he lives in the United States. The United States did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and he ignores that it has been very effective internationally in curbing not only carbon emissions, but helping solve for the root cause of climate change, which is what our advocacy is proposing. He says that an economic incentive, there is an economic incentive to keep polluting. Actually, the opposite is true. There is an economic incentive to do the most good for the most people, and this is helping to keep carbon emissions low, helping to mitigate global warming, because that way companies will have more customers to sell to. Our argument is that we can mitigate the root cause of climate change in Ethiopia through a multi-tiered, multilateral program.
In this debate, we have a fundamental difference between the affirmative and the negative team. They want to do a 5% reduction mitigation in climate change, whereas we want to be able to solve the real impacts that are going to occur when this climate change happens and when climate shocks happen. And that adaptation is really important. When we have these problems existing today, and when we still are talking about global warming 10 years later, it proves that what we really need to do is start getting ready for the idea that the climate is going to get hotter.
This debate ultimately comes down to one issue. Which is better for Ethiopia? Adapting to the disastrous effects of climate change, or mitigating global warming itself? You must decide whether Ethiopia should be forced by the United States to change their culture, their way of life, due to the irresponsibility of the West. or whether this country should continue to empower itself in order to stop the root cause of climate change. The affirmative's proposition resembles the all too common waste of resources in a country that is already developing its own solutions to the problems of the status quo. Ethiopia is taking the initiative to mitigate the effects of climate change through their plan for accelerated and sustained development. We, the negative, advocate building upon these solutions, which have already laid the foundation for success, rather than crowding out these initiatives with new proposals like the affirmative's plan of action.